The boutique on Cheongdam-dong's most curated block didn't have a sign outside. It didn't need one. If you had to ask what it was called, you had already answered your own question about whether you belonged. Zola Neema pushed open the glass door, and the warm amber air of the store received her the way expensive places always do, with the particular silence that isn't peaceful, but evaluating. The kind of silence that has opinions. Everything inside was deliberate. Clothing hung in color-blocked arrangements, each piece spaced exactly far enough apart to suggest that crowding them would be an insult. The lighting came from somewhere soft and indirect, the kind that made expensive things look inevitable rather than purchased. The floors were pale marble, veined in gold that caught the light and held it. So the air smelled like cedar and controlled ambition, and the faint suggestion that if you had to check a price tag, you were already the wrong kind of person. Zola stepped in and let the door close behind her. She was tall, not just in height, but in the particular way some people carry altitude in their posture, like the air around them has agreed to behave differently. Her copper-toned satin slip dress moved with her as she walked deeper into the store, the fabric catching the amber light and returning it warmer, richer, like something that had absorbed years of living rather than hours of retail display. The dress had a history you could sense without being told, a gentle softness at the bias cutum, a particular drape that no brand-new garment ever achieves, the quiet elegance of a thing that had been chosen and worn and chosen again. Over it, she'd layered a camel blazer with clean, structured shoulders. Slightly oversized in the way of someone who'd selected it because she loved it, not because it had been placed on her body by someone whose job it was to make her look like a concept. The lapels sat open. The sleeves came just past her wrists. Her hair grew from her crown in a full, voluminous cloud of dark coils, tense and deliberate, framing her face like something that had decided its own shape and committed to it entirely. It caught the boutique light at the edges and gave nothing back. It was the kind of hair that makes a room reconsider what it thought the word presence meant. Her expression was calm, not the performed calm of someone working very hard to appear unbothered. The real kind, the kind that only comes from having stood in enough rooms exactly like this one to understand, completely and without bitterness, what they are. And having decided, somewhere quiet and private and entirely her own, that they no longer held the power to decide anything about her. She didn't scan the room for approval, didn't check whether she was being watched, or adjust her posture for an audience, or allow her eyes to do the apologetic darting that this particular kind of room was designed to produce in people who weren't sure they belonged. She walked like she was the only person in the boutique, which, in the ways that matter most, she was. The three women on the velvet settee noticed her before the door finished closing. They were impeccable, undressed in the kind of coordinated neutrals that announce wealth without ever raising their voice. Ivory, bone, the particular shade of champagne beige that costs more than it has any right to. Their accessories were small and significant. Jewelry that didn't need to be large to be understood. Bags that communicated entire conversations without a single logo. Their posture was the posture of women who had been seated in expensive places long enough that it had become their natural shape. The first, dark hair swept into an architectural knot, a structured ivory blazer that had clearly never touched a second-hand rack in its life, saw Zola and tilted her head. A small, private recalibration, the kind of micro-expression that passes between women in rooms like this one before anything is said aloud. So because the language that lives beneath words is the most fluent one. She leaned toward the woman beside her. The second, champagne-colored dress with precise pleating, a bag in her lap worth more than most people's rent, cheekbones that looked like they'd been arranged with intention, glanced toward the door. then back, then permitted herself a small, controlled smile that she didn't bother fully suppressing. The third caught the direction of their attention, understood it immediately, and looked away in the particular manner of someone who is still absolutely looking. The whispers started low. Zola heard them. She always heard them. This was one of the things she had learned about rooms like this one. The whispers were never actually quiet. They were constructed to carry. Cruelty requires a recipient. The subtlety was just plausible deniability, the same performance in a more expensive costume. Is that vintage, do you think? A pause, weighted with meaning. Vintage implies someone chose it. Laughter, brief and silver-edged, dressed as something softer. The woman in the ivory blazer glanced at her companions and then back at Zola with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just landed a line and is waiting for the audience's confirmation. Her friend in champagne lifted her glass of complimentary water and looked away, which was its own kind of agreement. Zola moved further into the store. She ran 2 fingers lightly along the collar of a displayed jacket without breaking her stride. She paused at a rack of structured pieces and began moving through them with the unhurried ease of someone who had not received the room's instructions about how she was supposed to feel right now. She lifted a sleeve, checked the lining, considered the weight of the fabric between her fingers, with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what she was looking for. The laughter from the settee had not stopped. It had simply changed shape. Softer now, more domestic, the kind that settles into a room and makes itself comfortable because it has decided it owns the furniture. Here is what Zola Neema didn't do. She did not look toward the settee. She did not adjust her posture, did not pull the blazer closed, did not move faster through the rack or slower, or did not perform ease, or perform distress, did not offer the room the thing it had arranged itself to collect. She had felt every syllable. Let no one believe otherwise. Each whisper had arrived at its intended destination and had been received clearly, without static or misunderstanding. She was not numb to it. She was not above it in the way that requires performance. She had simply made a decision long before she walked through that particular glass door on that particular Seoul afternoon, that she would not turn her dignity into entertainment for people who were hoping to watch it dissolve. Her composure was not armor, was not defense. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. It was the settled knowledge of a woman who had already answered the question the room kept trying to ask her, and she was worth the space she occupied. Full stop. No conditions, no supporting evidence required. And so she moved through the boutique the way she moved through every room, completely, without apology, without the particular smallness that certain spaces are designed to produce. She stopped at a rack near the center of the boutique and lifted a forest green structured jacket from the hanger, held it at arm's length. The cut was precise, the shoulders clean, the lapels wide enough to be interesting without becoming costume. She turned at once to examine the lining, deep burgundy silk, unexpected and considered, and felt the particular satisfaction of finding something that had been made by someone who cared about the parts no one was supposed to see. She placed it back on the rack. She did not purchase approval from her own hands first. She simply touched things and knew what she thought about them, which in a boutique like this one, where every surface was designed to make you feel like your opinion needed qualifying, was its own quiet form of resistance. The woman in the ivory blazer watched her do this, and something shifted in her expression, barely perceptible, but present. The slight recalibration of someone whose performance is not landing the way it was supposed to. Zola's stillness was doing something the woman hadn't anticipated. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pride in the brittle, visible way that can be dismissed as overcompensation. It was something else. something the ivory blazer couldn't name, which made it more unsettling than anything she could have named. She leaned toward her companion again, said something that didn't carry across the floor this time. The champagne dress responded with a small shake of the head, not disagreement, but recalibration. Even she had felt it, the particular discomfort of realizing that the person you've been performing at has not noticed the performance, not because they missed it, but because they have decided it is beneath their attention, which is a different thing entirely, and a more devastating one. What no one on the velvet settee had registered, what no one in the boutique had noted, because he had the particular stillness of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of existing in rooms without being located by them, was the figure near the far wall. He was positioned beside a display of dark, tailored suits, which could have been coincidence. With this particular man, nothing was ever coincidence. Han Su. He was tall, in the way that doesn't announce itself, dressed in a suit so precisely constructed, it read less like clothing and more like a decision. Dark navy, single-breasted, nothing excessive, nothing decorative, nothing present that hadn't been considered and found necessary. His posture was the posture of someone who had trained himself out of the habit of filling space for the sake of it. He occupied exactly as much room as he required, and not a centimeter more. His hands were loose at his sides. His expression was unreadable, not because it was blank, but because it had been refined into something beyond the usual range. The face of a man who had learned that revealing what he was thinking was a form of currency, and he had no interest in spending it cheaply. He was not browsing. He was not waiting. He was watching Zola. Not the way the women on the settee watched her, with the specific appetite of people expecting humiliation as entertainment. He watched her the way a person watches something they are trying to understand correctly, with precision, without the overlay of what he wanted the thing to be. He had arrived at this boutique 14 minutes before Zola walked in. He had come for a specific reason, unrelated to any item of clothing in this building. He had intended to be visible for less than 5 minutes and then leave. He was still here. His eyes had not moved from Zola since the moment the glass door opened. He watched the way she moved through the racks without seeking permission from the room first. Directly, with authority, on with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already decided she was allowed to be here and had no remaining interest in the debate. He watched the way her spine didn't adjust when the laughter arrived from the settee. He watched the particular quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of someone frozen by exposure, but the stillness of someone who had already resolved the moment internally and was now simply moving through its aftermath. He had been in many rooms. He had watched many people perform confidence like a costume that needed constant adjustment, pulling it straight when someone looked, smoothing it down when the temperature changed, checking their reflection in every available surface to confirm it was still sitting correctly. What he was watching now was not a performance. He shifted his weight slightly, uncrossed his arms, watched her lift the forest green jacket from the rack, examine it with that focused, unperformed attention, place it back, watched her move to the next rack without looking toward the settee. Something in his expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness did. A settling, a deepening. The shift of a man who has been observing with detachment and has just become, despite himself, interested. On the settee, the dynamic had been recalibrating for several minutes, and the woman in the ivory blazer had decided, the way certain people decide things when a situation is not resolving in the direction they designed, that a slight escalation was required. She had not intended to speak loudly. She would have denied, if asked, that she spoke loudly. But the boutique was arranged in the particular way of spaces that carry sound without appearing to, and when she turned to her companions and said what she said, it arrived across the floor at exactly the volume she had intended, and precisely the volume she would later claim she hadn't. The staff here really have become relaxed about their door policy. A beat. Anyone can just walk in now, apparently. Her companion in champagne brought her hand up to her mouth. A sales associate near the entrance looked up from the register, looked back down. The particular discipline of someone whose job requires them to have not heard things they have clearly heard. The third woman on the settee glanced toward the floor, which was not disagreement. The comment settled into the air of the boutique the way these things do. Not loudly, not violently, but with the specific weight of something designed to stick. It was the kind of cruelty that arrives gift-wrapped in plausibility, the kind that can later be described as an observation, a comment about standards, a general remark that no one in particular should take personally. Zola was standing at a rack near the center of the floor when it landed. She was holding a structured blazer in deep charcoal between two fingers, turning it slightly to examine how the fabric moved in the light. She placed it back on the rack. Then she turned. Not toward the settee, toward the sales associate near the entrance, a young woman, early 20s, who had managed to achieve the professional blankness required of someone who works in a place like this, but whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly at the comment from the ivory blazer. Zola walked toward her. The room watched. She stopped in front of the associate and said, in Korean, that was precise and entirely without accent-related apology. The green jacket on the center rack, the structured one with the burgundy lining. Do you have it in a size up? Her Korean was not the Korean of someone working very hard to be understood. It was the Korean of someone who had decided some time ago that this was simply one of the languages she spoke, and had treated it accordingly, with the casual fluency of a person who learns a thing because they find it interesting, not because they are trying to prove something to a room. The associate blinked, then straightened. Yes, I believe we do. Let me check the back. Thank you, Zola said, pleasantly, unhurriedly. She turned back toward the rack. The woman in the ivory blazer had heard the Korean, had processed it, was now doing something with her expression that she would have described to herself as composure. From the far wall, Han-Soo watched the exchange, watched the precise, unshowy way Zola had deployed her fluency, not as a weapon drawn loudly, but as a door opened quietly, the kind of move that reframes a room's entire understanding of what it's been looking at. His eyes settled on her with a different quality now. Not assessment, recognition. The associate returned from the back of the store with the jacket folded carefully over her arm. She offered it to Zola with both hands, the particular formality of someone who had quietly, without announcement, decided to recalibrate how they were treating this customer. Zola took it, shook it open with a single practiced movement, and held it against her shoulder in front of the nearest mirror. She looked at her own reflection the way she looked at everything else in this boutique, directly, calmly, without asking it for reassurance. The woman in the ivory blazer on the settee said nothing. Her companion in champagne had set her glass of water down. The third was looking at the floor with the careful attention of someone who has begun to understand that they arrived at the wrong conclusion about a situation and are now quietly trying to locate the exit from that understanding. In the corner near the tailored suits, Han-Soo had not moved, but he had stopped looking at anything in the boutique except Zola Neema. And the particular quality of his attention, the weight of it, the precision of it, and the way it had nothing in common with the attention that had been directed at her from the velvet settee, had begun, slowly and without drama, to change the temperature of the room. Not loudly. Not yet. But in the way that things change before they change. The specific stillness before a shift. The held breath before something irreversible moves through a space and rearranges everything inside it. The boutique on Cheongdam-dong held its expensive silence, And somewhere in the quality of that silence, everything was already different. The associate who had retrieved the jacket from the back room was named Ji-yeon, and she had worked in this boutique for 2 years and 4 months, which was long enough to have developed a very precise internal sensor for when a room was about to become something it wasn't supposed to be. The sensor had been active for the last several minutes. She moved back toward the reception desk with the particular controlled efficiency of someone who is performing routine tasks while allocating most of their attention elsewhere. She straightened a stack of embossed cards that didn't need straightening. She adjusted the angle of the small arrangement of dried botanicals on the corner of the desk that had not moved. She was doing what trained staff in places like this do when the temperature of a room changes, maintaining the surface while monitoring what's happening underneath it. She was not the only one. Across the boutique, near the entrance to the fitting corridor, a second associate, older, mid-30s, with the careful posture of someone who had been in luxury retail long enough to understand that her job was not really about clothing, had registered the comment from the ivory blazer the moment it left the woman's mouth. She had filed it, as she filed most things in this boutique, under noted but unaddressed, because that was the protocol. These women were regulars. They spent significant amounts of money in this space on a regular basis. The boutique's position on certain kinds of behavior was the position of all places that depend on the consistent patronage of people who sometimes behave badly, which is to say, no formal position at all. But she had watched Zola respond, had watched her walk to Ji-yeon, speak her Korean without performance or announcement. I'd request the jacket with the easy directness of someone entirely comfortable in her own authority. Had watched Ji-yeon's posture change, that small, almost imperceptible straightening that happens when someone recalibrates how they are treating another person and commits to the recalibration. The senior associate glanced toward the velvet settee. The woman in the ivory blazer was looking at Zola's reflection in the mirror with an expression that had moved past amusement into something harder to name, something with more edges. The kind of expression that forms when a person realizes the dynamic they designed is not resolving correctly and is now deciding whether to let it go or sharpen it. The senior associate recognized that expression. She had seen it before in various faces, in various configurations of wealth and entitlement. She knew what it typically preceded. She moved quietly to Ji-yeon's side at the reception desk. "Stay close to the floor," she said, low, without looking at her directly. Ji-yeon didn't ask why. She already knew. The woman in the ivory blazer had made a decision. It was not an impulsive decision. She was not an impulsive woman. Impulsive women didn't maintain the kind of curated life she had constructed, didn't hold the particular social position she occupied, didn't dress the way she dressed, without a very precise understanding of how every detail communicated within her specific world. She operated with intention. Everything she did was considered. This was considered. She stood from the settee. It was a small movement, a simple shift from seated to standing. But in the specific ecosystem of this boutique at this moment, it registered the way small movements register when a room has been very still for a long time. The champagne dress looked up. The third woman on the settee lifted her chin slightly. The ivory blazer walked, slowly, with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned every floor she had ever crossed, to a rack approximately 4 feet from where Zola was standing, with the green jacket still held against her shoulder. She began browsing, or performing browsing. The distinction was visible to anyone paying attention, which in this moment included everyone in the boutique, except, apparently, Zola. She moved through the rack with one hand, barely touching the garments, her eyes drifting with practiced casualness toward Zola's reflection in the mirror ahead of them. She selected nothing. She was not here to select anything. "That color," she said, conversationally to the general air between them. Zola's eyes in the mirror did not move toward her. "It's a difficult one." The ivory blazer tilted her head with the expression of someone offering genuinely helpful feedback. "It tends to read quite informal on certain people." The pause before certain people was brief enough to deny and long enough to land. Zola lowered the jacket from her shoulder. She looked at it in her hands for a moment, not with doubt, but with the particular focus of someone completing a thought they were already in the middle of. Then she folded it once, neatly, over her forearm. She turned to face the mirror fully, and in the mirror she looked at herself. Not at the ivory blazer, not at the reflection of the room behind her, or the settee, or any of the faces that had arranged themselves into various configurations of watching over the last 20 minutes. She looked at herself, at the copper dress and the camel blazer and the full cloud of dark coils, and the face that carried its expression the way it always did, with the settled quality of someone who had already had every conversation this room was trying to start. Then she looked at Ji-yeon, who was standing near the reception desk. "I'll take it," she said, simply, in Korean. "The green one." Ji-yeon moved immediately. "Of course, I'll wrap it for you." The ivory blazer's hand paused on the rack. She had expected something. A flinch, a deflection. The particular energy of someone who has been made to feel small, attempting to recover their footing, which always, in her experience, made them smaller. What she had not prepared for was this: the complete, quiet, unbothered finality of a woman who was simply purchasing a jacket. As if none of this was happening. As if the ivory blazer was a piece of furniture she had decided not to interact with. The champagne dress, still on the settee, had gone quite still. From the far wall, Han-soo had watched the ivory blazer stand and walk to the rack near Zola, with the specific attention of someone who identifies the structure of a situation before most people have finished registering that a situation exists. He had seen this architecture before, not in boutiques specifically, but in rooms, in the geometry of who moves toward whom and why, in the deliberate casualness of a provocation that wants to look like something else, in the calculated placement of a body near another body for the purpose of making that other body feel surrounded. He knew what it was. He also knew, had known with increasing certainty for the last several minutes, that Zola Neema was not a woman who could be made to feel surrounded. Not because she was unaware of it, but because awareness, for her, did not translate into the response the room was waiting for. He had been watching her for long enough, now that he understood something specific about her. She had already decided, at some point before entering this building, that the only person whose assessment of her carried weight was her own. And she had made that decision the way the most irreversible decisions are made, not as a performance or a stance, but as a simple, settled fact about how she intended to live. It was the rarest thing he had encountered in a very long time. He took a step away from the wall, not toward the settee, not toward the ivory blazer, toward the center of the boutique, a slow, deliberate repositioning, the kind that doesn't announce itself as movement, but changes the spatial logic of an entire room simply by occurring. The senior associate near the fitting corridor noticed immediately. Ji-yeon, wrapping the green jacket at the reception desk with careful, unhurried hands, looked up once and then back down. The ivory blazer, still standing at the rack near Zola, registered a shift in the room's atmosphere without being able to locate its source. She glanced toward the far wall with the instinct of someone who has spent enough time in rooms with powerful people to have developed a peripheral sensitivity to changes in those rooms' gravity. The space where the dark-suited figure had been standing was empty. She looked toward the center of the boutique. Found him. Something in her expression changed. Subtle, but total. The specific recalibration of a woman who has just understood that the room she thought she was in is a different room entirely, with a different set of rules, and she has been operating under the wrong instructions. She took one small step back from the rack, which she would later not remember as a step back. Han-Soo stopped approximately 8 feet from where Zola was standing. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the rack of jackets with the expression of someone who is not looking at jackets, which is to say, he looked at them with no expression at all. His hands remained loose at his sides. His posture was the posture of a man in the exact location he intended to be. Zola was aware of him. She had been aware of him. In the peripheral, unperformed way she was aware of everything in this boutique, since some minutes before. She had noted his position near the far wall, the way she noted all the architecture of the room, not with emphasis or anxiety, but as information. She had registered the quality of his stillness as distinct from the stillness of the other people in the store. Different texture, different origin. Now he was closer. She continued standing where she was, unhurried, waiting for Ji-yeon to complete the wrapping. Han-Soo turned his head slightly toward the rack. Then, without the preamble of performed browsing, without the theater of pretending he was here for something other than what he was here for, he looked at Zola directly. She felt the shift in his attention the way you feel when something that has been observing you from a distance decides to stop maintaining the distance. She turned her head and looked back at him. For a moment, the boutique was very quiet. Not the expensive, curated quiet of its usual operating atmosphere, but a different kind. The held-breath quality of a room that has stopped performing its own ambiance because something more interesting is happening. Han-Soo's expression was the same as it had been from the wall, unreadable in the way of a thing that has decided not to waste itself on surfaces. But his eyes, dark or precise, with the particular quality of someone who has trained himself to see things correctly rather than conveniently, were focused on her with an attention that had nothing in common with the attention she'd been receiving from the settee. That attention had been trying to reduce her. This was trying to understand her, accurately, without projection. "The jacket," he said, quietly, in Korean, but with the cadence of someone who was not performing the language, simply using it. "You chose it without hesitation." It was not a question. It was an observation, offered cleanly, without social packaging. Zola looked at him for a moment. "I knew what I was looking for," she said. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then something in the quality of his stillness deepened. That same settling she had observed in him from across the room, and the shift of a man who has received information he considers significant. He looked toward Ji-yeon at the reception desk. The ivory blazer had returned to the settee. She had not announced the return, had simply relocated with the careful, face-saving precision of someone who has decided that the position they were occupying is no longer advantageous and has chosen to adjust without drawing attention to the adjustment. She sat beside her companions and looked at the floor for a moment, and then at her bag, which she opened and closed without removing anything. The champagne dress said something low and private. The ivory blazer responded with a small movement of her head that wasn't quite a nod and wasn't quite a shake. So the third woman on the settee had gone very quiet in the way of someone who has been reconsidering the last 30 minutes in real time and has arrived at some conclusions she would prefer not to examine too closely. Ji-yeon had completed the wrapping. The green jacket sat on the reception desk in a flat, clean rectangle of tissue, ready for the boutique's signature bag. She looked toward Zola. Zola moved toward the desk. Han-Soo moved at the same moment. Not toward Zola. Toward the desk. Specifically toward the store manager, a composed woman in her 40s who had been positioned near the reception area for the last several minutes, with the practiced stillness of someone who has been watching an entire situation develop and has been waiting, with professional patience, to understand what her role in it was going to be. She understood now. Han-Soo stopped in front of her. He said nothing for a moment, which was itself a form of communication in rooms that understood how power speaks. Then he reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and produced a card. Matte black. No decorative excess. The kind of card that communicates everything it needs to communicate without trying. He placed it on the desk in front of her with 2 fingers. The manager looked at it. Looked at him. Something moved through her professional composure. Not quite surprise, because she had known who he was from the moment he entered the boutique. But the particular quality of surprise that arrives not at information, but at what the information is about to require of you. "Mr. Han," she said. Carefully. "The inventory," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without drama, which is the register in which the most significant things are always said. All of it. The display pieces, the current stock, everything on this floor. The manager's composure did something complicated. I'm sorry, are you?" "Today," he said. The word landed in the boutique the way a stone lands in still water, without violence, but with the particular inevitability of something that was always going to happen from the moment it was set in motion. The manager looked at the card. Back at him. She was a woman who had spent 15 years in luxury retail, learning to read rooms, and this room was telling her something very clear, which was that the correct response here was not to ask clarifying questions. "Of course," she said. Han-Soo said a number. It was a quiet number. Precise. Final. The kind of number that exists in a register most people in this boutique had never needed to access, because their lives didn't require it. The manager's breath did not change audibly, but her posture shifted, a millimeter, no more, in the way of someone who has just had the stakes of a moment confirmed. "I'll need to make a call," she said. "Make it," he said. She reached for the phone. The boutique had gone absolutely still. Not the managed, performative stillness of its usual atmosphere. Something raw. The stillness of a room that has had the floor rearranged beneath it and is currently recalibrating which direction is down. Ji-yeon had stopped moving. She was standing behind the reception desk with her hands flat on the surface and her expression carefully arranged. But her eyes, trained on the manager, on the phone, on Han-Soo's profile, were doing the work of someone who is witnessing something and understands that the act of witnessing it is its own kind of significance. The senior associate near the fitting corridor had not moved in 2 minutes. The ivory blazer was sitting on the velvet settee, with both hands folded in her lap, and her eyes directed toward a point, somewhere on the marble floor between her feet, that had suddenly become very interesting. The champagne dress beside her was similarly engaged with the middle distance. The third woman had her fingers lightly touching the strap of her bag, in the absent, repetitive motion of someone whose hands need something to do, while their mind attempts a rapid and uncomfortable reassessment. None of them were laughing. The laughter had not been silenced by confrontation, had not been addressed, challenged, called out, corrected, or argued with. It had simply encountered a reality it was not equipped to exist inside, and had dissolved the way laughter always dissolves when the room becomes too serious for it. Quietly, without drama, leaving no forwarding address. Zola was standing at the reception desk. She had watched the exchange between Han-Soo and the manager with the same calm, observational attention she had applied to everything else in this boutique. Present, clear-eyed, without performance. She had heard the number, had heard the manager's response, had understood, completely, and without requiring it to be explained to her, what was happening and what it meant. She did not look toward the settee. She looked at Han-Soo. He turned from the manager and looked back at her. And in his expression, still unreadable in its broad strokes, but carrying for the first time since he'd stepped away from the far wall, something that might, in a different context, be called acknowledgement. There was the specific quality of one person recognizing another across a room and finding the recognition uncomplicated. "The green jacket," he said. "It suited you." Zola held his gaze. "I know," she said. The manager was on the phone. The conversation was brief and conducted in the low, precise tones of someone who has a specific kind of call to make and makes it without wasting either party's time. She mentioned a name. She mentioned the number. She listened for approximately 30 seconds to the response, during which her expression remained composed, but her eyes moved to Han Su's card on the desk and rested there with the focused attention of someone confirming that what they are looking at is what they think it is. Then she said, "Yes, of course, I'll arrange it." She placed the phone down. She looked at Han Su. "We can have the paperwork prepared within the hour," she said. "I'll need your team's contact for the inventory transfer." Han Su reached into his pocket again, produced a second card, different from the first, practical rather than identifying, and placed it beside the first. "They'll expect your call," he said. The manager nodded once. Then, with the kind of professional grace that only comes from genuinely not knowing what else to do with the situation, she said, "Will you require anything else while you're here?" Han Su didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Zola, who was lifting Ji-Yan's carefully wrapped package from the desk with both hands, settling the ribbon handles in her fingers, with the particular ease of someone who is simply completing a transaction she came here to complete. "The lady's purchase," he said. "Include it." Zola looked up. Her expression didn't flood with gratitude or soften into the kind of affected surprise that is its own form of performance. She looked at him with those calm, direct eyes and understood, in the way she understood most things, the precise nature of what was being offered. Not charity. Not rescue. Not the performance of a man who needs an audience for his generosity. Something else. The specific acknowledgement of one person by another who has seen them correctly. "That's not necessary," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. A beat. But I'm buying the store," he said. "The inventory is mine. The green jacket is inventory." The logic was precise and entirely without loopholes, and delivered with the straight-faced quality of someone who was aware of exactly how it sounded. Something moved in Zola's expression, small, almost imperceptible, but present. Not quite a smile. The particular quality of a face that is deciding whether or not to become one. She looked at Ji-Yan, who was watching this exchange with the concentrated attention of someone trying very hard to maintain professional neutrality while privately finding it impossible. Then she looked back at Han Su. "Fine," she said simply. Ji-Yan made a sound that she immediately converted into a cough. The boutique manager had begun the quiet, efficient work of the next steps: the calls, the documentation, the administrative machinery that converts a room full of expensive clothing into a completed transaction of extraordinary size. She moved between the desk and the back office with the measured, purposeful energy of someone who has been given a clear task and is grateful for its clarity. Ji-Yan completed a new receipt for Zola's jacket and placed it in the bag with both hands. The senior associate near the fitting corridor had finally relocated. Not far, just to a position nearer the center of the floor, where she could be more useful and where the gravitational shift of the room felt more navigable. The boutique was quiet, but it was a different quiet than it had been an hour ago. The earlier quiet had been performing something, performing exclusivity, performing curation, performing the specific kind of welcome that is designed to make certain people feel unwelcome. That quiet had been active, pointed, alive with the small, vicious energy of people who believe the room belongs to them. This quiet was something else. This quiet was the quiet of a room that had the story it thought it was telling interrupted by a different story, one it hadn't written, hadn't prepared for, hadn't known was in progress, while it was busy with its own small cruelties. On the velvet settee, the ivory blazer had not spoken for several minutes. Her companions had not spoken either. The three of them sat in the particular silence of people who have made a miscalculation of sufficient magnitude that they are still in the early stages of understanding its full dimensions. Their postures, which had, at the beginning of this afternoon, carried the specific relaxed authority of women who owned the rooms they sat in, had shifted into something more careful, more contained. The unconscious adjustment of bodies that have just understood they are not, in fact, the most significant people in the room and have not been for some time. The ivory blazer's eyes moved to Han Su once, briefly, with the instinctive assessment of someone trying to identify exactly how badly they've misread a situation. What she found in his profile, the clean, unreachable authority of it, and the complete absence of any interest in her direction, told her everything she needed to know and nothing she wanted to hear. She looked back at her lap. She did not speak. Zola lifted the boutique bag from the desk, settled it in her hand, and turned toward the door. She did not look at the settee. Not because she had forgotten it was there. Not because she was above it in the performative, demonstrative way that requires its own kind of audience. She didn't look at the settee because she had nothing to say to it, and she had understood that from the beginning, and the last hour had not changed her position on this in any direction. She was 2 steps from the door when Han Su spoke. "Zola." She stopped. Turned. He was standing in the center of the boutique, with his hands loose at his sides, and his expression carrying that same precise, unperformed quality she had been observing since she first registered his presence near the far wall. He looked at her, the way he had been looking at her for the last 40 minutes, as if he was trying to understand something correctly, and had decided she was worth the effort of the accuracy. "You didn't flinch," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation, offered with the same clean directness as everything else he said, without social scaffolding, without the softening that certain kinds of truth require when they are offered to people who haven't earned the right to deliver them bluntly. Zola looked at him. "Was I supposed to?" she asked. He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said, and then something in his expression shifted, barely, the way the quality of light shifts when something passes in front of it for a moment, and then moves on into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, and was, in its adjacency, more interesting than a smile would have been. Zola turned back toward the door. She pushed it open with one hand, unhurried, and stepped out into the afternoon light of Cheongdam-dong, where the street continued at its usual pace, indifferent and ongoing, as streets do. Behind her, the boutique held its new silence. The settee was occupied by 3 women who had arrived here with a very clear understanding of the social order, and were now in the early, uncomfortable stages of revising it. The manager was on another call, her voice low and efficient and purposeful. A Jian was straightening the reception desk with the careful attention of someone processing an afternoon they would be thinking about for a long time. The senior associate had finally exhaled, and Han Su remained in the center of the floor, not moving, not performing any of the usual gestures of a man who has just spent a significant amount of money on a significant decision. Not looking toward the settee, not requiring the room to acknowledge what had happened, not arranging his posture to receive credit for a moment that had never been about credit. He looked toward the glass door through which Zola had just passed. The street was visible through it, briefly, before the door swung closed. A rectangle of ordinary Seoul afternoon, unbright and indifferent, and full of people moving through it, with their own private architectures of purpose and intention. He stood in the center of the boutique for a moment longer, Then he looked at the manager, who was watching him with the attentive, careful expression of someone waiting for final instructions. "Have the inventory transfer completed by Thursday," he said. "Yes, Mr. Han," she said. He picked up his card from the desk, the identifying one, not the contact, and returned it to his inner pocket. Left the practical card where it was. He walked to the door, pushed it open, stepped out. The velvet settee held its 3 occupants for another few minutes. They sat without speaking, which was itself a kind of statement. The involuntary statement of people who have had the conversational ground removed from beneath them and have not yet identified what to replace it with. The ivory blazer looked at her bag, at her hands, at the space in the center of the boutique where Han Su had been standing, which was now simply floor, pale marble, veined in gold, indifferent to everything that had occurred above it. She thought about saying something to her companions, framing the afternoon in the particular way that certain people frame afternoons that have not resolved in their favor, recasting, repositioning, finding the version of events in which her role is the reasonable one. She was good at this. She had spent years developing the skill. But her companion in champagne was already gathering her bag from the cushion beside her, standing with a small, private efficiency, not looking at her directly. The third woman stood at the same moment. They did not discuss leaving. They simply began the process of it, the way people sometimes conclude things, without a formal ending, just a gradual movement in the direction of elsewhere. The ivory blazer stood last. She walked past the reception desk, where Ji-yeon was completing her straightening, past the rack of forest green jackets, where one hanger now stood empty, past the place near the far wall, where a dark-suited figure had been standing for the better part of an hour, watching a room arrange itself around someone it had tried to make small. She did not look at any of this directly. She pushed the glass door open and walked out into the afternoon. Ji-yeon, alone at the reception desk for a moment, looked at the empty boutique floor, at the velvet settee, now unoccupied, with its 3 slightly displaced cushions, and the small table beside it, where 3 glasses of complimentary water had been set and barely touched. At the center rack, where the green jacket's empty hanger caught the ambient light and held it. At the door, through which 4 people had exited in the last 10 minutes, each carrying a different version of what this afternoon had meant. She thought about what Zola had looked like walking in, the copper dress and the camel blazer and the full dark coils and that expression, that settled, unperformed, entirely unassailable expression, and what she had looked like walking out. Identical. That was the thing. That was the specific, remarkable, quietly devastating thing. She had walked in like someone who had already decided she was worth the space she occupied. She had walked out the same way. The room had spent 40 minutes trying to tell her something about herself, had deployed whispers and laughter and pointed comments and the full apparatus of social cruelty that certain rooms maintain and deploy with practiced ease. And Zola Neema had received none of it, not because she hadn't heard, but because she had heard, and had considered, and had declined. Ji-yeon straightened the last item on the desk, looked toward the door once more. Outside, Cheongdam-dong continued at its usual pace, ordinary and ongoing, and full of people moving through it. Somewhere in it, a woman in a copper satin dress and a camel blazer was walking with the particular deliberate ease of someone who has nowhere she needs to be in a hurry, and knows exactly where she's going. The boutique settled into its new quiet. The power in the room had been redistributed, not loudly, not violently, not through argument or confrontation, or any of the dramatic architectures that power usually requires when it moves. Quietly, decisively. In the specific register of things that are done by people who don't need the room's confirmation to know that they are done. Zola had not been rescued. She had been recognized, and the difference between those two things was everything. Some people enter a room and change it forever, without saying a word. Subscribe and walk with Zola into whatever comes next.